It's Sunday, August 25, 2024. I'm Anthony Davis. Welcome to the Weekend Show, where we make the time to consider the news of the week. You can support my work and independent journalism at patreon.com/5minutenews. I'm thrilled to say that our guest is a physician, a forensic and social psychiatrist, a world expert on violence, and is president of the World Mental Health Coalition. She became known to the public as the editor of the New York Times bestseller, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. She predicted that the Trump presidency would not end with the 2020 election and warned of the violence that was to come. Dr. Bandy Lee, welcome back to the Weekend Show.
Thank you very much for having me back.
Now, this is very unusual for us because normally we have different guests each week, but we're making an exception. And I'm very thrilled that your schedule has allowed this and that you've accepted this invitation to spend more time with us analyzing the mind of Donald Trump, somebody who has never had a full psychiatric meeting with any clinician, it seems. Just explain to us, before we get into the details of what he's been saying this week and what it means, just explain to us about the evaluation that he claims to have had and whether or not, because obviously he says, I aced it. It was a very simple test with words and pictures and animals and things. Just explain why that is not up to standard in this moment.
Sure. First of all, thank you very much for your willingness to have me back on a weekly basis, because of the dire need that we have at this time and the dearth of mental health knowledge in the midst of a mental health crisis that is afflicting the entire nation. So I appreciate this opportunity very much. Well, we've heard Donald Trump repeatedly speak about a cognitive test that he took, that he aced, that somehow proves that he is ingenious and one of the smartest people on earth. But the only test that we can gather he has taken, the only one that's been made public, and that's actually the one that he has been referring to whenever he gives details about the test, is the Montreal Cognitive Assessment Test that Dr. Ronnie Jackson gave in January of 2018 in order to, in fact, quell the inquiries that were being made of his mental health at the time and fitness. But it is actually a very crude screen that we barely use because it doesn't quite mean anything. Though patients who have been diagnosed of dementia have been known to pass it. Patients who are hospitalized with schizophrenia have been known to ace it. It's basically about a 10-minute cognitive screen that doesn't tell you very much, certainly is not enough to rule out dementia. I call it a nursing home test because if you don't pass it, you would be going into a nursing home. Dr. Jackson at that time erroneously promoted it as a fitness test. In fact, afterwards, he stated that based on this test, Donald Trump was mentally fit to serve. But Dr. Jackson has never been trained to perform a mental fitness test. He was not qualified at that time as a White House employed subordinate to the commander-in-chief. He did not have the independence to be able to perform a mental fitness test. He barely was qualified to diagnose the president. That's what a personal physician does. A mental fitness test, unlike a diagnostic test, is not for the patient. It's for the public, the employer, whoever is requesting the test, the courts for in times of criminal trials or civil trials. And so to be able to pass this test, to be able to perform this test, you have to be independent, and assigned by whoever you're doing the test for, not the evaluee.
And we should say that Ronnie Jackson is a MAGA Republican who then entered politics with Donald Trump's endorsement and is, probably the last person you would ever want as your physician. So with that in mind, let's park that, because it's important, isn't it, that people don't go, oh, well, he did that test and he passed with flying colors. He told us that.
Let me just add that Ronnie Jackson's lack of independence did not stop there. Just as you pointed out, he was vying for a cabinet position after that. When that did not go through, he vied for a position on Congress. And it came out that that was not the only medical malpractice that he committed. He had dispensed controlled substances without doing proper examinations or getting proper histories. He was drunk on the job. He was mistreating subordinates. And so there are many problems associated with this, but I have said that he has perhaps committed the greatest medical malpractice in history when he misled that an unfit president was mentally fit based on a test that had nothing to do with fitness.
He also said that he weighed around 220 pounds, which is a very simple example of how the untruths and the disinformation is very much at the heart of that assessment. So let's look to Donald Trump now, because obviously he would never willingly put himself in front of a psychiatrist like yourself. He would never be open to that kind of analysis. He would literally have to be in some kind of institution where he was probably tied down to take part in a session. So, but the difference with him is that he is on television every day. He's posting on his Truth Social every day, a stream of consciousness. He is making speeches with no inner monologue. He says all the quiet parts out loud, which we'll come to when we analyze his North Carolina speech in a moment. And that gives you as a clinician enough material to work with. And some say you don't even need to be a clinician to diagnose Donald Trump as being mentally ill. But and I don't want to diminish your qualifications, but it is very clear that he wears his issues on the outside, doesn't really try that hard to keep them in. So just talk to us for a moment about this notion that, we are effectively here doing a psychiatric session about a man that refuses to be analyzed. How close are we going to get?
Well, that's going to be a red flag. And, in terms of diagnostic tests, we, nowadays don't rely solely on a personal interview, and in-person examination. In fact, observing behavior over time, over extensive periods of time, especially when he has decades of constant coverage, video, audio, in all different settings, and in actual function as president. We know very well how he's operating. Mental fitness tests are to gauge whether or not someone will be able to perform the duties of office. And now we have seen just how dangerous he can become. And dangerousness precludes anyone from fitness. But above all, we did perform a mental fitness test when the appropriate information became available. That is through Robert Mueller's report in April of 2019. We convened a panel of top mental health experts from around the country to assess the data that were available that was relevant to a fitness evaluation. We had abundant data, more than we ever had for any fitness evaluation we had done in the past, under sworn testimony. This was incredibly high quality, essentially the best information we could ask for. Reports by coworkers and close associates reporting on their interactions with the person in order to complete the evaluation, we did send out a request to the president at the time that he submit to a personal interview within a certain period of time. And if he did not do so, we would consider it a refusal, and that we may go on with our evaluation if we had enough data. And those are all the standards. You make a reasonable attempt at engaging the person in an interview, but a fitness evaluation does not require a personal interview, because obviously someone can lie or mislead about their own function. And so a personal interview is not always required. In fact, for certain dangerous disorders, it's detrimental to accuracy, because
the word observation is very interesting, isn't it? It reminds me of autistic children being viewed through a one-way mirror whilst they're at play, for example, by clinicians. They observe them for a good amount of time and see how they interact and how they play and how they communicate. That's effectively what you're doing with Donald Trump by having access to the same video that we all have access to, which is him both on camera and off camera. And there's plenty of off camera stuff as well, where he has a slightly different personality. We've seen it recently with him on the golf course, with Barron sitting next to him in the golf cars, and him being very abusive about Kamala Harris. And so I would like to just point out for people watching who may say, and some will probably say, and even comment below and say, well, how can you do this when he's not present? This is an observation. And I think that is why people need to just understand that it is as important, if not way more important, as you say, than having him in the room where he's only going to lie to you anyway. And so you might as well just do it at a safe distance. That's right.
I just like to point out that a fitness evaluation, again, is a functional test, unlike a diagnostic exam, which is for treatment of your client. And here the client is the public. Because the public,
it's not like we're seeking to medicate Donald Trump and therefore we have to, have his consent. This is your duty to warn as a clinician. And also we should probably point out that this is not because we are both liberal people who don't want him to win the election. This is about the safety, not just of America as a nation, but to the rest of the world, who are currently scrambling just in case he does win the presidency, knowing that he is aligned with Putin and he sees dictators as his allies and friends of the US as his foes.
Yes, well said. We as medical professionals have a duty to society as we do to patients. And our measure is not whether, in fact, political affiliation does not even come into the equation. It's whether an action supports life or and prevents death, and also promotes well-being anywhere in between. And so that is our measure. And my concern when I first came out to speak up about Donald Trump was because I was concerned for the public's health and safety, having nothing to do with political concerns. I was never a political person.
Maybe we should just focus on that for a moment. What would you say from a clinical perspective to the people, likely MAGA Republicans, who will say it's not possible for you to be non-partisan in this? Just explain the separation, because I do think that people that are so brainwashed into the cult of Trump and to that far-right MAGA politics, they're not able to understand that you can have a different view professionally to the one you may hold personally.
Life and health do not have a political affiliation. It's not dependent on ideology. Indeed, these are requirements for different ideologies to be pursued and for one to grow into the political preferences that they have. We assume health and mental health, but it's not always a given. In fact, in this situation, it was not. People talk about fascism as being a political ideology, but for me, I've been saying that it's mental pathology in politics, which follows the characteristics of pathology, not a variation of any ideology. Genuine ideologies are always life-affirming, even if we have our disagreements. And we can also resolve our disagreements based on data, information, facts. And these are the kinds of things that a psychiatrist or mental health experts who are essentially scientists, applied scientists, bring to the table. And in fact, when I met with Congress members, over 50 of them invited me to consult with them. They welcomed this expertise or this kind of neutrality that we were able to bring. They, in fact, relied on us to educate the public medically so that they could intervene politically. Because without our information, everything they did would simply be seen as a political attack, whereas we would be able to state the standards of practice, the measures we use in every case, determining what is fitness or unfitness before we get to the particular individual. So there are quality standards and consistency of application of different examinations and scales throughout the population that we perform tests on. And so that's what we did for Donald Trump when we had the appropriate data available. And we did this as a public service because we were getting so many messages from the public, essentially by that point asking, where are the psychiatrists? Where are the psychologists? Because we have been blacked out of the media, as you know. And so we felt that it was a service to the public. They were asking for some kind of response. And so we performed it as a pro bono service. And Donald Trump was found to fail all the criteria for mental fitness. In other words, he would not be fit for any job, not just the presidency. For the presidency, we may have added more requirements than the basic mental, rational decision-making capacity that we tested him for. But he did not meet even the most basic criteria. So that means that if he were not running for presidency, he would not qualify for just about any job. What people don't know is that every task and every job requires mental fitness. So not every job requires it as a test before you assume your position. That is required of law enforcement personnel or military officers. Those who handle nuclear weapons are required to pass rigorous psychological testing every year. But it's rather ironic that the commander of these weapons is not required to pass any test, not even the most basic one. And most jobs, people are presumed competent until they show they're not able to fulfill the function. Then they may be removed from the job and be required to pass a fitness evaluation before they return to the task. But a president does not. And so we need to think about this as a people, whether these are the kinds of requirements we find acceptable for a president, the highest office in the land. It does not make sense that it would have the lowest requirements, enabling people who would not otherwise be able to hold any job to vie for the presidency.
Should the evaluation for a president be done in the candidate stage? So you don't want to wait until they win the election because it's too late by then. So are you saying that candidates effectively that maybe, or is it before they even win their nomination with their party, that they should have a psychological examination and pass a certain criteria? Where would you suggest it's done?
Yes, absolutely. That would be most ideal. if they could be tested at the candidacy stage. We actually recommended that this test be performed to all presidential candidates, and even after election to be renewed every year, just like it's done for military officers and done rigorously for those who handle nuclear weapons. People argue that it's not part of the Constitution, but many things were not part of the Constitution and have become part of the Constitution through amendments because we have a different knowledge base now, and there are many developments that have been made. But even just when Joe Biden was running, we recommended that he undergo the fitness evaluation voluntarily to be able to help set the standard for future candidates or future presidents. And had he done so, he may have avoided all the projection accusations, false accusations and attributions that happened thereafter in order for Donald Trump and his acolytes to deny his impairments.
It's interesting, isn't it, how Joe Biden was so much of a distraction. It really exposed how little people knew about mental health when they were claiming that he was senile and that he was mentally ill and actually he was just growing old graciously. And you know, the confusion, the very clear public and journalistic confusion, not seeing the difference between somebody who is suffering from dementia in Donald Trump, where there is a clear sundowning and deterioration very publicly, versus Joe Biden, who just needs to have a sleep in the afternoon for him to be on form in the evening. And I think that, you know, it was really the debate, that debate was the line in the sand for everybody, but still there was a failure to talk about mental health to any great degree, I would say.
That's right. That's where expertise is helpful.
Right, yeah.
The reason society has put aside its investment in experts in certain areas to be able to devote their careers, their lifetimes to a single area is so that we would have this kind of honed skill available. Decades of clinical practice and a century and a half of scientific knowledge does make a difference. We may be able to recognize that Donald Trump is not mentally well. We may all be able to recognize that he's dangerous, but in order to truly assess what is wrong with him, how to intervene, and measure how dangerous he is, whether it is a simple nuisance or existentially dangerous to the nation's, the survival of the nation's democracy and the existence of the human species, is a measure that expertise could help with. And I would even say that mental health issues require even greater refined knowledge because of its intricacy. I mean,
it's such an unknown quantity. If you don't know what you're talking about, you could claim anything and nobody really would have any evidence. It's not like I often say it's not like an injury. You know, if you break your arm, it's going to be in a cast. People can see the injury, and it's quite a kind of simple process of repair. But mental health is so different. On the other hand, it can
cause the greatest danger. Yeah. A patient could die instantly if they're in mental distress and harm themselves or harmed others.
I want to go back to something that you said earlier, just before we go on to the actual analysis of his recent language. And that was that you talked about this notion of fascism being a mental health issue rather than a political one. Now, Donald Trump's hate speech, he completely changed the landscape in terms of, you know, abusing the opposition. The opposition became the enemy under Donald Trump. In fact, the state became the enemy under Donald Trump because, you know, from the moment the Mueller report began, he felt that America was against him. And so he clearly is now an enemy of the state, certainly the way he talks about these dictators and befriends them. But let's just talk to this idea that fascism is a mental health issue. Does that mean that people have kind of maybe been misled, that it's a contagion as you describe? Just talk to that for a moment, because I do see Donald Trump as a fascist based upon my reading of history. And not everybody is prepared to use the F word in this moment, are they? But if you understand history and if you compare him to these despots of the past, the pattern is identical.
Yes, you will detect that there are many similarities, and the pattern and course are almost identical. If you take the situation, culture, identities out, and in fact simply look at the phenomena, it's a repetitive cycle, and we see it in all different settings. We thought the US would be immune, but once it caught on, it took off like in any other setting. And that's how we identify disease, actually. Regardless of the person's personality or previous disposition, in fact, when human beings are healthy, they encompass such a wide spectrum that you can't really predict, or I mean, they're free and they're as varied as can be. But once they enter into illness, a pathological state, they become very predictable and rigid. That's why Donald Trump was very predictable to us. People are surprised that we predicted him so accurately so many years earlier and continued to predict him. It's not because we are foretelling the future. It's because of repetitive patterns that we recognize from others we have treated. And I, having specialized in treating violent offenders as a forensic psychiatrist who works in prison settings, I've seen at least 1,000 individuals just like him. What was unusual was that such an individual was running for the office of the presidency in 2016.
Slightly unusual, I'd say.
Yes. But over time, I had seen that the dangerous personalities that I had seen confined to jails and prisons in, say, the late 90s when I first began, they're increasingly taking leadership positions. And of course, they wreak havoc. They're the most debilitating psychiatric conditions, the dangerous personality disorders, because they often lack the basic human characteristics, such as empathy, capacity to love, almost any human emotion rather than anger, rage, and revenge, because they have this vengeance against humanity for having what they cannot access. And so it's extremely debilitating, but deceptive at the same time. In fact, seasoned clinicians often miss the disorder, but you can tell by the damage they do and the dangers they bring to whatever situation they happen to be a part of. And that is particularly why it's important for mental health experts who have this kind of expertise to speak up and to warn the public about these dangerous personalities. The public, they're often very beguiling. And so they more often attain leadership positions unless they're stopped.
So interesting, because Trump couldn't get a job. He worked for his dad. And then when his dad passed away, he just took over the business. And that is an example of him just being the king of his own castle. And I also wanted to mention that Melania Trump has not been present on the campaign at all. And yet we saw at the DNC the other night the images of Barack and Michelle Obama embracing on the stage, hugging and kissing and whispering sweet nothings to each other, and the same between Doug and Kamala Harris. This very normal, typical, and rather beautiful adult relationships that clearly Donald Trump is not able to have and has probably never had. We have to take a quick break, but I want to come back and analyze the speech that he made in North Carolina a couple of days ago. We'll do that next here on The Weekend Show. We often think living a more heart-healthy life means making big, unsustainable changes. Well, with Superbeats Heart Chews, you can get daily blood pressure support in just 2 tasty chews a day. And they even promote heart-healthy energy without the stimulants. Paired with a healthy lifestyle, the antioxidants in Superbeats are clinically shown to be nearly 2 times more effective at promoting normal blood pressure than a healthy lifestyle alone. Heart health is very important to me. I'd like to live as long as possible to enjoy my kids in old age. Effective and clinically studied from Superbeats, the #1 doctor, pharmacist and cardiologist recommended beet brand for cardiovascular health support. Double your potential with Superbeats Heart Chews. Get a free 30-day supply of Superbeats Heart Chews on all bundles and 15% off your first order by going to getsuperbeats.com and using code WEEKEND. That's getsuperbeets.com. Code WEEKEND. We're back with Dr. Bandy Lee here on The Weekend Show as we analyze the criminal mind of Donald Trump, who is a convicted felon now. And you know, I made a video the other day about the fact that he's been committing crimes his entire life and avoiding law enforcement. And now we have him up against Kamala Harris, a prosecutor, a former district attorney, somebody who is the law. And so I kind of said that he's furious that Joe Biden has stepped down because he's been replaced by a prosecutor. And he doesn't want to face prosecutors in the dock, let alone on the presidential stage. Let's just talk to that.
Yes. Well, I said from the very beginning that this would be a great advantage for her because having been a prosecutor, she has dealt with these individuals. She herself has said, just like myself as a forensic psychiatrist, dealing with these personality disorders on a regular basis, she too, as a prosecutor, would have been just as exposed to them. Actually, I wanted to read a part of her speech that I felt was very poignant about this. First of all, she did very well to say Donald Trump is an unserious man, but the consequences of putting Donald Trump back in the White House are extremely serious. I felt that she was now echoing much of what we were trying to say for the last 9 years. But when she said he encouraged Putin to invade our allies, said Russia could, quote, do whatever the hell they want, unquote. I will not cozy up to tyrants and dictators who are rooting for Trump because they know he is easy to manipulate with flattery and favors. She said that as part of her speech, and that's very much what we've been trying to state, that his dangerousness does not just end with what he does or what he says, which of course propagates throughout the nation to instill a culture of violence, but also the dangerous dictators he's enabled, who are now ready to do anything to get him elected, including threaten destruction of the world because of the advantages he brings. It's like night and day, whether you have a mentally impaired, dangerously minded, psychologically impaired person versus a normal, healthy individual who will not be selling her country for some favors by dictators who would act as parent figures for him.
It's interesting how he thinks that he's got Putin eating out of the palm of his hand. when Putin is a former KGB agent, highly trained killer who has been manipulating Donald Trump for years, arguably, and has marked him and is using him and has used him and is thrilled at the outcomes that he has he has got. And all
We have
Trump
seen.
does is say no collusion and is completely missing the party.
We've seen since the Helsinki conference just
Yes.
how obsequious he becomes. It has puzzled everyone. And in fact, that was the one episode where Congress actually wanted to do a press conference with us. And all the leaders got involved until it was canceled at last minute. But that was the press conference for which we were called to try to explain his behavior.
Shall I just remind people what happened at that press conference? He was asked a question by the press corps. He was standing next to Putin at the podium, and they said, "Have you asked Mr. Putin about election interference?" And Trump says, "Yes, I've asked him, and he said he didn't. And who am I to believe, the man standing next to me or the US security services who've warned me of this?" I mean, if that was not the fact that I memorized it is just proof how important that moment was, and yet it came and went, didn't it?
He chose Putin over the consensus of 17 U.S. intelligence agencies. And it didn't end there. He had secret meetings with Putin where the translator even was not permitted to take notes. Everything was done in secret. We don't know what could have transpired and what secrets could have been given away.
So with that moment, and let's also talk about this kind of NATO story that because this is something that he mentioned in the speech in North Carolina this week. And he's not been doing so many rallies. I'm of the opinion that he's been told that the election is going to be rigged and fixed for him to win anyway, so he's kind of less inclined to want to actually go out and do any work. But he spoke again about this NATO piece that he said, where he effectively said that he would encourage Russia to do whatever the hell they liked to the NATO allies and he used the word delinquent, which he claims is a real estate phrase that he uses for people who haven't paid up, rather offensive phrase in the first place. He doesn't understand how NATO works. He doesn't understand about the US having the largest portion of the pie and being effectively a world police and the importance of that by nature of the size and scale of its military. He doesn't seem to understand any of those things.
Well, none of reality matters.
Yeah, well, there is that, yes.
What matters is that he's calling other people what he is. So delinquent is very much the right
so
word.
The projection is a theme, isn't it? Very much a theme. So
yes.
When in North Carolina, he said, and just to quote, he said, the fake news gave me a hard time. The fake news was saying, "Oh, what a terrible thing to say to our allies. Our allies weren't paying." And I said, "You got to pay. We were paying for everybody. So they take advantage of us on trade, and then we also pay for their military. That somehow doesn't work. So they had to pay. They paid hundreds of billions of dollars, but I said to them, no, that means I will not protect you. I will not protect you. They said, sir, if we're attacked by Russia, will you protect us? Used to be Soviet Union, now Russia. Will you protect us? They said, are you pay? No. Let's assume we're not paid. Then you're delinquent, right? Yes, that's an old real estate term. You're delinquent. Yes, we will not protect you. The press went crazy that I ever said that. And you know what? If I would have said the other way, they would never paid hundreds of billions of dollars, were sent into NATO, but we defeated ISIS. We killed the world's top terrorists. I mean, I know it sounds very staccato when I read it, and I apologize for that, but I'm not trying to make him sound better than he is. He cannot speak. He has no ability to form sentences. He has an idea of what he wants to say, and then uses various words, and then delinquent popped into his head because he thought that because it had more than 4 letters, it made him sound smart, I presume. Give us your analysis of those few sentences, because it is a reminder to most of us that he is not just unfit for office, but unfit to even make a speech.
Yes, you're right, because his speeches are dangerous. He may not be able to form sentences, but he knows how to manipulate minds.
Yeah.
Adolf Hitler was said to be a seismograph of crowds, meaning that he could sense the needs of the crowds, sense their emotional vulnerabilities and dispositions, and to be able to play on those things as if playing an instrument, to be able to essentially turn them into his instruments. And Donald Trump has the same ability. It may be seen as an ingenious skill, but it's actually compensatory. It's compensatory of his lack of empathy, compassion, conscience, his inability to connect with other people emotionally. And so he has seen people not as other human beings, but as instruments to attain his goals. And he knows how to play them well. And that is his survival skill, because he's done it all his life and honed it in ways that no other normal person can. It looks like an extraordinary gift. And it looks like that he's a great entertainer or that he's a great politician. But it's actually beyond those things and more powerful than those things. But because it comes from a pathological place, it's very dangerous, because their end course will be destruction and deaths. We've seen it happen with the 1.2 million COVID deaths.
Yes.
Every hour that he was on the television, his own press conferences would pass. His need to undermine the numbers, reduce the risks, convince people not to take safety measures, telling them not to be afraid of COVID, that it was a hoax, that you could just simply inject bleach or take hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin, totally unrelated medications.
And then weaponizing it and making China, our largest trading partner, the enemy, and claiming that it was a bioweapon, and that backlash falling back onto Dr. Anthony Fauci, and again, dividing people for the conspiracists versus the realists, which caused more death.
That's right. And scapegoating populations like the Asian population.
Yeah.
And every hour manipulating minds to increase deaths. I could measure by every hour of his conferences how many more deaths Americans would experience. And that's how he became the number one, the leading
serial killer, effectively,
of infection and death. We led the entire world, despite the fact that we had the expertise and all the wealth and military and material to be able to quell this pandemic.
Well, there was a pandemic dossier that was left in the White House that he ignored. So let's talk more in more detail about this manipulation that he does, because people sometimes criticize me when I say he's a good speaker, like he is a master marketeer. I'm prepared to retract those statements if you're telling me that I too have been tricked by Donald Trump's manipulation and projection, and him trying to replace his lack of empathy by, he almost like tries to say what everyone must be thinking. So he's giving the response that he thinks that others will have. And if they haven't made up their minds yet, they take that on as being their response. I mean, this is quite detailed, but just explain to us at a level that we can understand how somebody who appears as stupid as him, doesn't seem to know anything about anything, but yet is able to convince us that he has the skill and the ability to take on the most responsible job in the world.
That was entirely through manipulation. And people with these kinds of disorders have been called spellbinders. They're hypnotizing. They are able to tap into people's vulnerabilities, make you believe that he's speaking your thoughts, when in fact his thoughts are quite of a different structure. I see him as bringing people onto his way of thinking and his thought structures, such as when you were mentioning about how he was calling NATO members delinquent. Look at the worldview he is bringing. He has a view of the world where people take advantage of each other. People are competing. There's no safe place. There's no room for collaboration.
Or diplomacy, for that matter.
Yes. In order for collaboration to happen and true power to be able to amass itself, you have to collaborate and trust and gather forces. That's something that he has broken apart during his presidency. And in fact, he calls himself the peace president. But the major conflicts that are happening in the world, including in Ukraine and in Palestine, these could be seen as having been instigated during Donald Trump's presidency. And he also brings up Afghanistan a lot. We know how he set up that disastrous pullout. In fact, when Joe Biden was going along with it and keeping Donald Trump's timeline, I was cringing that the results would be as bad as they were. But he leads people to think that what he in fact caused are happening because of other people. He does that very well. How did we come to a point where Donald Trump, who has severe mental impairments, cannot string a sentence together, as you said, cannot have a complex thought, has no knowledge, be able to convince people that he's a great speaker, he's knowledgeable, only he can do things. That is why knowing and understanding these psychological dynamics is so important, because the most dangerous individuals will also be the most deceptive.
It's interesting you talk about him claiming that he was like a peace president, and his phrase is "no war." There was no war when I was president, and I began to realize that he just didn't know about the wars because he never read security briefings. I mean, there was a war in Yemen that he seemed to know nothing about. The multiple conflicts that were going on around the world, in Africa and elsewhere, places. He would probably refer to them as shithole countries, so he doesn't really take an interest by definition of his racism. But the reality was that the conflicts that we're seeing now, as you quite rightly say, can be directly attributed to him. Let's talk about that withdrawal from Afghanistan, because he referenced this again in the speech. So let me quote him from the North Carolina rally a couple of days ago, where he said, "Crooked Joe Biden delivered the most humiliating event in the history of our country and one of the biggest military disasters in the history of the world. As far as I'm concerned, no one will ever forget that horrifying images of their catastrophic retreat from Afghanistan. Desperate Afghans fell to their deaths from the wheels of U.S. cargo planes that were 3,000 foot up in the air. Bloodthirsty terrorists poured out of the prisons after Biden and Harris surrendered Bagram, one of the largest air military bases anywhere in the world. We spent billions and billions of dollars building it many years ago, and you know it was important to keep it, and I was never leaving that. I would have been out faster than them. I said, that's up. We're there for 20, almost 21 years, and I said, what are we doing? What are we doing here? And we had no soldiers killed for 18 months while I was there, because they know I don't play around with our soldiers. They were killing them, and they were killing them under Obama. Did you see Barack Hussein Obama last night?" So I mean, there's a lot there to unpack, Dr. Lee. We should point out a few facts first. The withdrawal of Afghanistan was his idea. He didn't have a full plan for it. Joe Biden took it as a election promise effectively and did delay, I think, from May through to September to do the withdrawal. No equipment was left. Donald Trump has completely made this up. He says in the speech a little later something about, I think around 700,000 guns were left. And then he said, I don't even know what they would even need 700,000 guns for. And he said the guns are being sold. That is not true either. And also the images that he describes, which were very impactful. That C-17 that we saw people grabbing onto had just landed and was taxiing. And that was Afghans trying to get onto it, but that image was replayed and replayed and replayed. And what he's saying about the 3,000 feet and people falling is not true either. He has rewritten history. He has recreated a dramatic event and said it over and over so many times that people now have started to take those images they've seen on the news and re-edit them to fit his narrative.
Exactly. That is what he does best. He plays with other people's emotion. He's pretty much detached from reality to the point where no facts matter. None of reality matters. And he's playing on people's emotions, which he does best, in order to manipulate them, in order to use them, in order to advance his predatory agenda. And nothing will make sense from a logical point of view, a factual point of view. But it's very easy to get misled and led astray because he works with impressions and he makes things plausible by playing with other people's emotions. That's why I feel that mental health experts educating the public so that they would not fall prey to his machinations was critical. I mean, in some sense, mental health expertise has been, with the rise of mental health knowledge in the last century and a half, we have found all kinds of ways to cure illnesses, make people who are mentally ill functional, to relieve suffering. A lot of good has been done, but there's also a dark side to it. It's been employed to manipulate people in ways that have been very destructive. Propaganda or advertisement have been some avenues. So that's why I've emphasized that mental health knowledge should not be the purview of those who have money or power, that we have to constantly speak with the public. It's not just social media people who are trying to figure out how best to control others' behavior who should have this knowledge. It should be ordinary people who should use our knowledge like an instruction manual on how to protect their minds, how to practice good mental hygiene, to guard against mental pathology, to deal with personality disordered individuals who are masters at manipulation. And that is what was blocked when we were taken off the public arena, as you know, with the American Psychiatric Association working with the New York Times to remove us from all major media. When that happened, people did not really know why I was raising such alarms. Well, everything that has happened since then, I feel, could have been prevented if people had the right knowledge. Knowledge is power, and the power belongs to the people. For a self-governing people, they should not be prevented from having the knowledge, and for experts to be able to explain the knowledge to them. Mental health, as I said, is extremely intricate. We call brain surgeons kind of blunt and crude because from a mental health perspective, what they do is just doesn't get at the fine tuning of things. But we also know that there's a great deal of knowledge and principles that we put to use and put into practice that are extremely successful and helpful to individuals in protecting society, because I consult with the courts or prisons. Whether or not to release someone into society is an evaluation someone can do, whether or not someone is fit to stand trial, but fit to perform any job or duty, and also whether or not they are dangerous. In fact, the most eminent psychiatrists got together, formed a panel, and did a dangerousness risk assessment on Donald Trump, because right before what we thought would be the sentencing in July, we got together in June and did our assessment as we would to any sentencing judge to give our assessment and recommendations. We did this for the Manhattan District Court because that's the only case that's going forward right now. At the time of sentencing, you don't just consider charges, you also consider the level of dangerousness to society and also what the sentencing will do in terms of educating society on what happens if you commit similar crimes.
So
and
you're
so
setting
it's
a precedent for society to know that that's where the line is. Well, but the difference with this sentencing, which is due next month, is that this guy's running for president. So how is he ever going to get sentenced, even though the judge seems to be, very smart about it?
But
how is he ever going to get a proper sentence?
We also mentioned the truth that running for presidency makes him more dangerous.
Right.
And the potential that he will enter the White House makes him more dangerous than if he were an ordinary individual. And that was part of our assessment. That's what I've been saying all along. People have been saying there's no way that we would contain a president or even hospitalize him for a psychiatric.
But that's cultural, isn't it? It's not clinical. And, isn't this the problem? Is that Donald Trump clearly needs to be incarcerated, undoubtedly, from a safety perspective. And yet, because America has become so divided, courtesy of his political rhetoric, that he is claiming that it is persecution, political persecution, and that Joe Biden, who has nothing to do with this, is the one who wants to put his political opponent in prison. He compares it. He called himself, it's like they're doing a Navalny. Now, that's not a full sentence, but it is a quote. And of course, he's referring to Alexei Navalny, who was Vladimir Putin's opponent, who was eventually murdered by the Kremlin. So just talk to that, how he's able to use this moment where he knows that he should probably be in prison. Am I right? I mean, does he know that he's a threat to society deep inside? Is that why he's saying this stuff?
Absolutely. And he understands that manipulating the public, even if he worsens the public's collective mental health by making them basically enslaved to him and whatever he says, insulating them from other sources of information and making them basically having them abandon their own personhood and their own personalities to take on his followership, that is his way out of prison. And so that is why prevention was so important. That's why we came out so early before anyone called him dangerous. We called him dangerous and we said that it was a public health emergency. We weren't interested in him as an individual or as a patient, certainly not. He was certainly not our patient. We were concerned about the threat he posed to the public. And an impressive experience for me when I first entered maximum security prisons is that there are no perpetrators to be found. Everybody is a victim, and everybody has done them wrong, including society and the criminal justice system. That is the psychology that gets them to perpetrate in the first place. It's a dangerous psychology, and Donald Trump carries that psychology, and he convinces others to adopt it. So he's impairing the public from being able to hold him accountable and being able to see him as simply another citizen, another human being who may commit crimes and may have psychiatric impairments, who needs not only needs to be contained, but also deserves to get the appropriate treatment.
It's a remarkable indictment of somebody who has managed to evade not just law enforcement, but the kind of the I mean, he would be committed. That's really the word that I'm looking for. Like if he was in your own family, or he would have been committed by now.
Absolutely.
He would have absolutely no opportunity to mix in society, which is why when he said things as president to his immigration officials, why can't you just shoot these illegals in the legs to, prevent them crossing the border? He meant it. He wasn't joking. And so I'm of the opinion, and I suppose we could use that line that he said where I could shoot somebody in Central Park and get away with it. I mean, that is an example, or Fifth Avenue. I'm confusing the Central Park 5. He means this stuff. And given, if it was more socially acceptable, he would probably have done it by now. Probably would have shot a whole bunch of people on Fifth Avenue.
He killed 1 million Americans.
Yes.
And got away with it.
Yes.
Didn't lose any voters.
We have to take another quick break, but I want to come back and wrap up this week's analysis on the dangerous case of Donald Trump next. 10 seconds on the clock. How many things can you name that are always growing? Your relationships, your skills, your customer base? How about businesses on Shopify? When we started podcasting, an online store was the furthest thing from our minds. Now we're selling t-shirts and Midas Touch merch, and it's so easy, all because we use Shopify. Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business, from the launch of your online shop stage to the first real-life store stage, all the way to the "did we just hit 1 million orders" stage. Shopify's there to help you grow. Whether you're delivering daily digests or serving sensational scoops, Shopify will help you sell everywhere. From their all-in-one e-commerce platform to their in-person point-of-sale system, wherever and whatever you're selling, Shopify's got you covered. Shopify helps you turn browsers into buyers with the internet's best converting checkout, up to 36% better compared to other leading commerce platforms. And sell more with less effort thanks to Shopify Magic, your AI-powered all-star. Shopify powers 10% of all e-commerce in the US. And Shopify is the global force behind Allbirds and Rothney's and Brooklinen and millions of other entrepreneurs of every size across 175 countries. Plus, Shopify's extensive help resources are there to support your success at every step of the way, because businesses that grow, grow with Shopify. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/weekend. Go to shopify.com/weekend now to grow your business no matter what stage you're in. That's shopify.com/weekend. We're back on the Weekend Show with Dr. Bandy Lee. I'm Anthony Davis. So Donald Trump as a patient, we're kind of hypothesizing here that he's a patient in this conversation. And these are observations with the benefit of your expertise as a clinician specializing in violent offenders. We touched on the violence, and you've mentioned a couple of times in this conversation that he is violent. Just explain to people what that means, because they don't necessarily see him being violent. I mean, I certainly saw him being aggressive when he was at the G8 summit, pushing past world leaders and puffing out his chest and trying to give the impression that he was a strong man. But just talk about his pathology that suggests to you that he is a violent individual.
Yes. First of all, let me clarify that he is not our patient, and our patient is society.
Yes.
We are trying to protect the well-being and safety of society against a dangerous individual. And that's a criterion for hospital commitment as well. Danger to self, danger to others, or danger to society. And when we're assessing dangerousness, it's not for the individual or the individual's own treatment. That also comes, but it's primarily for protection of society. So, violence. We think of individuals who punch out another or pulls out a gun as being violent, but that's the least harmful kind of violence, in that if Donald Trump were to go out and punch out one person at a time, he would not be able to kill 1 million Americans in his lifetime. But if you have the kind of influence he has, says the kind of violent rhetoric he does, that can kill millions, and has. Dr. Phil Zimbardo, who is famous for his Stanford prison experiment, which is very revelatory in these times, by the way, and who also contributed to our book, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, said that sticks and stones may break your bones, but words kill. And the words that are violent and harmful, also policies that can be harmful when these are committed for psychological reasons, for psychologically impaired reasons, then we can count them as violence and show that they are far more deadly than any kind of even mass shootings. Don't come near the level of death someone with a violent mindset can induce through an entire population.
Let's talk about his promises if he was to win the presidency, that also encompass him being threatening and potentially violent. Because he spoke in this rally at North Carolina of insisting that any of the generals involved in the withdrawal of Afghanistan immediately tender their resignation. He's like, I want to see it on my desk on day one, right? So there's that. But, and I just want to quote him, he says, "The moment I lift my hand from the Bible after taking the oath of office, I will move to restore America to a maximum strength and return the world to the peace. We are going to return the world to peace. And mostly I can do it with a telephone call. You know, we don't have to send troops. I can do it with a telephone call. You go to war with another country that's friendly to us or even not friendly to us. You're not going to do business in the United States, and we're going to charge you 100% tariffs. And all of a sudden, the president or prime minister or dictator or whoever the hell is running the country says to me, sir, we won't go to war. I talked this world out of a lot of wars with telephone calls. I don't have to send in the troops. One of my most urgent priorities will be to quickly rebuild the readiness and spirit of the United States Armed Forces, and we will had it built, we rebuilt it, and we rebuilt the whole military." Again, apologies for the abominable English there. He is making a threat. I've always found it an interesting contradiction, the idea that you want to have the strongest military in the world, and yet you also want to pull the military out of every conflict in the world, or even as a peacekeeping task force. So it's like, yeah, we want the biggest military, but we don't actually want to do anything with it.
Well, we know that his mindset is not peace-minded. He's actually very violent and destructive. He loves powerful weapons. He taunts uh, enemy nations, and he is provocative. But he's at the same time a coward. He wouldn't bravely go to war head to head, certainly not. And he knows that war is not popular with the population. So he grabbed upon how we went into all these wrong wars, and he said that Hillary Clinton supported them, but he supported them in the beginning. That's what people don't recognize. And he loves to go to war. He has created a warlike climate for the entire globe during his presidency. That's something that people often overlook and may not be able to really see until you sit down with a psychiatrist such as myself, who has done public health work and can see how certain policies and rhetoric have an influence on the global stage. I do not believe that either Vladimir Putin or Benjamin Netanyahu would have been so emboldened to do what they have done if not the previous Trump presidency. Also, we don't recognize that violence has a lag period. So when he's talking about all the street violence and all the violence that has escalated under Biden's administration, he's actually speaking of the influence of his administration, because into 2020, early 2023, I did a study with eminent colleagues on violent death rates and the presidency, and presidency's influence on homicide rates has a 2-year lag period. In other words, it was very interesting. Over a 110-year period, with every Democratic administration, the violent death rates went down by half. So they would halve, and during Republican administrations, they would double, almost without exception, for 110 years. There was only one exception each, but they can also be explained through other factors. And Donald Trump is an exaggeration of that trend because the parties have been, they were alternating for much of history. We don't see that how they're starkly going on only one direction.
So it's hard to apportion blame by nature of that kind of pendulous nature of American politics. But his use of hate speech, we saw obviously after COVID, we saw that huge rise with Asian hate crime, but also the way that he communicates with the law enforcers. Famously, the speech that he made at a police event where he said, you know, don't support their head when they get into the back of the car, referring to people that had been arrested. You know, he says, you don't have to be so know And he was encouraging violence, as he has with anybody who's protested at his rallies, and he talks about them being removed. And, you know how we used to deal with people like that back in the day.
Just a couple days ago, when I was looking for the North Carolina rally that you said you'd be covering, I accidentally stumbled into a Michigan rally where he had 2 police officers behind him.
Yes.
And he was stating that Kamala Harris is a Marxist prosecutor who only goes after the police, law enforcement, and so she's anti-crime and soft on crime. Of course, that couldn't be further from the truth.
Right.
Actually, we do worse with crime under Republican administrations, and do everything possible to make ourselves unsafe. But again, because of that 2-year lag period, they've been able to flip the narrative.
It's so interesting, isn't it? Because the narrative has been flipped so much that people, if they were asked in the street to, what are the Republicans offering? Well, law and order, and they don't spend the debt goes down, and it's completely the opposite, isn't it?
The
It's
opposite.
completely the opposite. And that is
including the economy.
including the
The economy thrives under Democrats. Under Republicans, we plummet. More depressions and recessions happened under under Republicans rather than Democrats. And it's a complete reversal in people's minds.
And Bill Clinton made a very good point in his speech at the DNC. He said that since the 1970s or whenever he entered politics, he said that 51 million jobs had been created, and of those, 50 million were created by Democrat administrations and 1 million by Republicans. It flies in the face of the national conversation. So maybe finally we can talk to this contagion that you talk about, Trump contagion, because I do think that that's part of it, where people have been brainwashed into thinking that Republicans have something to offer that they have never offered. And Donald Trump is the purveyor of this misinformation.
That's right. And it's not just information that is being transmitted, misinformation that is, but actual symptoms. We know from social media studies that negative emotions are transmitted far more rapidly than positive emotions, but frank mental symptoms are 1,000-fold more rapid in spread. And so my greatest fear, in fact, when Donald Trump came into the presidency was not his symptoms, but the symptoms he would spread among the population. We don't think of mental symptoms as being contagious, but in fact, they are even more so because you do not require physical exposure to catch the symptoms. You only need emotional bonds. And with the social environment, social media environment that we have, as well as the mass media environment, they spread very rapidly. And also mental symptoms are psychosocial. So they do spread easily outside the confines of an individual, even though pharmaceutical industry psychiatrists will disagree. That's not consistent with the science. So that's what
I mentioned households, because households have experienced the split politically. Often the parents versus the kids who still live at home, for example, or even between a couple who might have opposing political views because Donald Trump has weaponized all of this language. And it's broken down a lot of society because it's become so polarized. And it's the opposite to, where I'm from. Certainly when I used to live in the UK, the left and the right were really very, very narrow. The conservatives would never ban abortion, for example. It's just, they still believe in human rights to a point, not quite there at the moment. But this is obviously a planet-wide contagion where, and as we alluded to earlier, the rise of the far right has taken hold because of disinformation and misinformation. And it's almost as if that this hatred or this anger towards the establishment or to institutions has, as Donald Trump played on when he first ran in 2016, he talked about the fact that he wasn't a politician and that he was the everyman, despite the fact that he was sitting on a gold toilet. So that to me has always been fascinating, how he has convinced ordinary people that he is ordinary and he is representing them when nothing could be further from the truth.
Well, he also said he loves uneducated people.
Yeah.
And these are the people who would be the easiest to manipulate. And they would not be informed about such dangerous personalities. They would not know to consult with experts. And so they would also not have a critical thinking method that's been inculcated in them through education. And so they would go along with what he says and then be more and more deeply immersed to the point of not being able to get out. They've invested too much.
It's very sad, isn't it? Because, I've unfortunately fallen out with people over politics, relationships that I really cared about, because people, as you say, fail to think critically or don't have the ability to think critically or to cross-reference, or they only get their information from a silo that is giving them what they want to hear.
It is very tragic. I hear about those stories constantly.
Yeah.
Of family relations, couple relations,
yeah,
friends for life breaking up. And that should be a warning signal as well. If you are abandoning your own relationships, your own friendship and love relationships to support this man, and you're sacrificing your life, giving up your personhood, your personality, your livelihood. We know that these are often poor people who are buying all these paraphernalia from Donald Trump. And that's why it's often called a cult. The Trump contagion I describe is the psychological phenomenon that happens within cults, but it doesn't have to be a cult, a physically isolated cult, in order for these psychological dynamics to happen. They're happening nationwide and
in plain sight
in the world.
This is such a essential conversation. It's such a deep subject to get into. And that is why we decided that it was important to have you join us each week so that we can disseminate the misinformation, but also hope to educate voters to understand how big the threat is. We have to finish now, but let's do it again next Sunday at the same time. Before I let you go, I just want to mention that you have an excellent website, bandylee.com, where you are also seeking fundraising for your all-day Dangerous Case of Donald Trump Leadership Fitness Conference in Washington, D.C., which I know is a major event that you're looking forward to. So I encourage people to go to bandylee.com and support if possible.
Thank you. It can only be possible with your help. So thank you for announcing that. And thank you. I'm very grateful to have this opportunity to be able to explain what we are seeing on a weekly basis, because there's a lot to explain and a lot that can be helped and prevented if the public had the information.
Okay. Well, for now, and certainly for this week, Bandy Lee, thank you for joining The Weekend Show.
Thank you again for having me.
I'm Anthony Davis. Don't forget to support me and independent journalism at patreon.com/5Minute News. You can see more from me on the 5 Minute News YouTube channel. And I'll be back next Sunday with Dr. Bandy Lee and more news to discuss here on the 5 Minute News Weekend Show with Midas Touch.